Hello, welcome, and salutations to Den of Otaku, Den of Geek's official anime discussion series, where we break down all things anime, Japanese pop culture, all the biggest developments going on in the industry. I am your host, Daniel Kurland, and in this episode, we are celebrating Shinichiro Watanabe's misunderstood masterpiece, Space Dandy. We're going to talk about the infancy of Watanabe's career and the kind of stepping stones that led him to make Space Dandy in the first place, why Space Dandy is such a unique piece of anime programming, and now, 10 years after Space Dandy's debut, why it deserves a little more love and why it has kind of become this underrated footnote in Shinichiro Watanabe's career. So let's do it, fellow otaku. It's always dandy in space, kids. Okay, otaku, we are talking about Shinichiro Watanabe, and if you're even just a casual anime fan, you've probably heard about this guy. His biggest claim to fame is arguably Cowboy Bebop, but he's done a lot of great programs, and Space Dandy is a show that is near and dear to my heart, and I want to really kind of celebrate it in a way that hasn't happened to what the show deserves. But before we talk about Space Dandy, I thought it would be a good idea to kind of just break down Watanabe's career and what led him to make something like Space Dandy in the first place. So Watanabe was born in Kyoto. He cut his teeth as a supervising director on a lot of Sunrise productions. Sunrise is a big anime studio. They're still around today. They were one of the bigger names in the mecha genre. A lot of the best mecha series come from Sunrise, and Watanabe kind of bounced around a different number of productions as supervisor director until he got his first real directing gig as a co-director on Macross Plus. Macross Plus is the very popular follow-up to the Macross series, and Watanabe's work on Macross Plus was so appreciated and so well received, he was given the privilege of directing his own anime, which became Cowboy Bebop. Cowboy Bebop was his first solo directing credit, and it was such a hit that Watanabe kind of just got a blank check to do what he wanted. And from that, you see a lot of really exciting series. Some of them are mainstream, some of them are a little more niche, but all of them kind of help further just develop who Watanabe is as a storyteller, but also kind of evolve the themes that have been in his work from the very start. So from Cowboy Bebop, we got Samurai Champloo, which is this really fun anachronistic quest for a samurai. There was then Kids on the Slope and Terror in Resonance. Terror in Resonance is a really interesting deviation for Watanabe. It's kind of this nihilistic cat and mouse terrorist thriller with like child soldiers. It's really intense stuff and a lot darker than Watanabe typically gets with his work. And the thing is though, all of these works were very well received to the point that they made Watanabe one of the most bankable names in the anime industry and someone who was really kind of set up for success. People wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. And Watanabe honestly has kind of like a similar career to Tarantino. He's almost like anime's Tarantino to some extent in the sense that he is always kind of remixing different influences, different genres, creating these hybrid worlds that don't exist in reality, but kind of just mash a bunch of passions together. I mean, you can see a lot of like the sensibility of Pulp Fiction, Kill Bill, Inglourious Bastards in Watanabe's work. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood too, like a lot, even Jackie Brown, like a lot of those kind of touchstones in how they create original stories that are kind of just filtering through Tarantino's brain. That's a lot of what Watanabe is doing too. You're getting this like direct link to the things that excite him kind of funneled into an anime, and he doesn't worry about what makes sense, what might not mesh with the time period, and it gives you this really unique, passionate energy. And Space Dandy, I think, is probably the most misunderstood and overlooked title in his career, which is really kind of interesting because Watanabe has been very vocal about how it allowed him to be some of the most creatively free that he's ever been on a production, but it just didn't hit on a mainstream way that he was anticipating. It kind of became a disappointment, even though he had such a beautiful time on it. So Space Dandy becomes this really interesting catalyst in his career that kind of showed Watanabe that he's not necessarily invincible, that some projects don't always work, but this is a project that deserves to work. Like, it really should have gotten him more opportunities and set up an even brighter career for him. And we'll get into kind of more later on just why Space Dandy met or didn't meet people's expectations. But another just interesting thing about Watanabe is he is such a creative visionary that all of his shows kind of exist in the same universe too. And there are very subtle ways that this is done. There's a currency named Wulong, which is kind of present in all of his shows. So that's one way that these worlds are linked together. You see a lot of similar ideas, a treatment with Mars, and just like kind of benign iconography that pops up in all these series that kind of tells you unofficially, like, oh, I guess Cowboy Bebop and Space Dandy are in the same universe. I guess Terror and Resonance might exist in the same world as Samurai Champloo. And even though that stuff hasn't necessarily amounted to anything, it's just exciting for fans, and this whole kind of world-building connected universe is obviously something that's all over the place now, but the fact that Watanabe was kind of casually experimenting with this is really cool. And I mean, it does open the opportunity that if he ever wanted to do some big anniversary project, there is a precedent that these worlds can collide, that they can overlap, and it would just be so much fun if he decided to finally bridge these gaps and do one big crossover series that puts Spike Spiegel together with Dandy and just all these other characters and really just celebrates the worlds he's created in one new world. And I just think it's really cool that Watanabe does kind of blur these lines together in a way that really feels natural. And another really interesting detail about Watanabe as well is, like, I think now is a great time to kind of get in on board with him just because he has such a big series that's premiering this year. He's working on a show for Adult Swim called Lazarus that kind of became the impetus for doing the Space Dandy episode. Before we get into Lazarus, it kind of makes sense to go all in on just one of his bigger misunderstood series. And Lazarus sounds very exciting. It's about like a neuroscientist turned mad scientist who has this cure-all drug that's supposed to fix the world, but people learn that 42 months after you take this drug, it actually kills you.
3 years after ingestion, Hadna will mutate, killing all those who have taken it. But you should all know that I currently have the cure. You have 30 days. So unless you find me within that time, hope will be lost forever.
So it's a great hook for a show. It was apparently inspired by kind of the opioid crisis and just climate issues and global warming. All of that gets funneled into Lazarus, apparently. Another interesting detail about this is Keiko Nobumoto is a collaborator with Shinichiro Watanabe, who has been there for most of his career. She helped him write Cowboy Bebop, Samurai Champloo, and she was a big voice in Space Dandy. And she helped Watanabe conceive of Lazarus, but unfortunately she passed away in 2021. So despite how she was involved in the impetus of Lazarus, this is going to be one of the first series that Watanabe is doing without her, and it'll be interesting to see how he's able to take her ideas and kind of contextualize them into something new and just kind of carry on her legacy and champion what she brought to his projects in this kind of post-Nobumoto era. It'll be very interesting for him. And Lazarus, too, something I wanted to point out is a big deal about this show, too. In addition to it just being a new Shinichiro Watanabe show on Adult Swim, Chad Stileski, who is like the stunt coordinator and director on the John Wick films, he is also doing action direction in Lazarus. So the fact that they've gotten this huge name to kind of help bring Lazarus to life is really exciting. And it kind of segs into another point that I think is so interesting about Watanabe. In addition to him being one of the most bankable names in the anime industry, he's also gotten some really exciting opportunities to mess around with US IP. He directed 2 of the segments in The Animatrix, which was such a breakthrough vehicle to kind of introduce anime to a lot of people in North America. He also directed Adult Swim's Blade Runner Blackout 2022 short, and he also directed Flying Lotus's More music video, which is actually based on his anime Samurai Champloo. So you have a lot of international people who are so in love with Watanabe's work, his voice, that they want him to come on board and just help give his creative vision to projects that they're doing. And I think that's really important, that he's a name that's become so big that his work has spilled over into North American pop culture. So the fact that then North American pop culture people are using him to kind of redefine their established properties is a dream come true for someone like Watanabe. That he can be inspired by something like Blade Runner in Cowboy Bebop and then get to create a new piece of Blade Runner is the coolest thing around. I mean, it would have been great if he could have done a full-length Blade Runner anime, if he did a full-length Matrix anime. Both of those things would be cool. I think it could even open up new opportunities for him in the sense that it would be really cool if Watanabe did a Mad Max anime, if he did an Avatar anime. Like, these avenues really exist, and just the fact that Watanabe has had the privilege to kind of play in both of these different sandboxes and create something that's a hybrid between the two is beautiful for him, but also just a really great encapsulation of the kind of work he produces, that his work feels like this international amalgamation, and for him to be a catalyst in that is so cool. Another really important trademark of Watanabe's work is that music is so important to him. If you watch something like Cowboy Bebop, Samurai Champloo, music is omnipresent in this stuff, but it isn't just these shows, it's present in everything he does and really a guiding force for him. He views music as this universal language that can tell you so much about not only someone's character, but also just tone and energy. And it's really interesting to see how much thought he puts into an anime's soundtrack and the different things he's doing. And this carries over through all of his work, whether music is part of the story being told, like it is in Kids on the Slope and Carole and Tuesday. But, you know, music can also be more the subtext in his productions in something like Cowboy Bebop, Space Dandy, and Terror and Resonance too. So it goes both ways. But you look at something like Cowboy Bebop, and there's a real influence of American reference points there. You have a lot of jazz, funk, and blues in Cowboy Bebop. Samurai Champloo goes for a more anachronistic thing where you have this hip-hop music in an ancient Edo period Japan setting, which is really a lot of fun. Kids on the Slope builds upon that as well. Terror in Resonance is like a really interesting example that it has this like post-rock ambient sound that's influenced by Sigur Rós and just Icelandic music in general. It creates this really isolating, extreme nihilist sound that's really jarring.
Sphinx 1号です。爆発大好き2号です。都庁の花火楽しんでもらえましたか？
Space Dandy at the same time too, you have this new wave sound that has a lot of pop and punk influences, specifically from the 80s and 90s. What I think is really cool about Space Dandy is he has a full jazz orchestra assembled for the show's soundtrack, but none of the instruments are instruments that were made after 1984. So you have this very specific brand of orchestra that's intentionally dated itself because Space Dandy has this really lost in time, unpredictable, Dadaist kind of sensibility, and that comes to life in the show's soundtrack.
There's oxygen here. Well, how was I supposed to know that?
All of his programs really use music to help advance the themes, the characters, and just create a more cohesive idea of what a universe stands for. And Watanabe is so heralded for his music, he's even been asked to be a music producer and a music advisor on other people's shows. I mean, he gets so hands-on with this on his own shows, but the fact that outside anime productions are like, we want you to be in charge of figuring out our music is so cool at the end of the day. He's worked with great people like Yoko Kanno, who did Cowboy Bebop and Terror and Resonance, but just, he has such good sensibilities here, and even though it's not the most important part of Space Dandy, it is just another factor in what makes Space Dandy so cool and what makes a Watanabe production feel like a Watanabe production. Okay, so now that that context is out of the way, let's talk about Space Dandy. Just the name Space Dandy sounds ridiculous. You're like, what is this show? Should I take it seriously? Is it just fluff? And the thing about Space Dandy is it is all of these things and so much more. A basic logline for this show is that it's about an alien bounty hunter named Dandy, who is just a dandy guy in space who wants to catch alien bounties so he can make ends meet and go to his favorite restaurant named Boobies, which is basically just like a more degenerate version of Hooters. He has a robot sidekick called QT. He has an alien cat sidekick named Meow. And basically, each episode, you're going to a different planet, you're hunting a new bounty, and shenanigans ensue. You know, it's very simple. And what I think makes Space Dandy such a unique anomaly is that on its surface level, it's not trying to do anything revelatory. It seems very basic, but it surpasses all these expectations and really evolves into a beautiful, complex, universal property that's one of the most impressive things Watanabe has ever done. It is just such a feat. And I mean, that feeling you have when you're watching Cowboy Bebop for the first time and you're like, this is so special. This is such a special thing. Space Dandy has that same feeling, but just amplifies it. Like, there's such a great feeling when you get about a few episodes into Space Dandy where you're like, oh, this is what this show is going to be. I don't understand, but it's going to be incredible. And I mean, it really has that feeling of like what Rick and Morty would kind of be doing early on in its run. When Rick and Morty, the anime, came out and kind of failed expectations there, Space Dandy is doing what Rick and Morty the anime should have been doing. It just is a fun, episodic, sci-fi loving experience. And the thing with Space Dandy is even the tiniest details amount to something that much bigger. It's a show that really necessitates repeated viewings. I mean, this is a show where the villain is like a giant anthropomorphic gorilla who flies around in a spaceship that looks like the Statue of Liberty's head, but with a ball gag in it. And I mean, you can interpret this as like kind of political commentary on America's perversion. It can be viewed as like corruption of America's ideals, or maybe it's just like a Planet of the Apes reference at the end of the day. Like, the fact is, Space Dandy has these triple entendres that run through it where you really need to look at everything and be like, wait, is this what they're joking about? Is this what they're joking about? It's really a remarkable feeling. The other thing that I really think makes Space Dandy special is, in addition to kind of this silly, absurdist, nothing matters point of view, it culminates into this incredible commentary on identity. And it kind of basically tells you that Dandy is like the one constant anchor in the multiverse, that every universe has its own Dandy, and that he's this privileged figure who needs to exist. It gets to the point where Space Dandy is ready to make Dandy God, which is basically Space Dandy's narrator is established to be God, and the narrator is tired of being the narrator, so he wants to make Dandy God, so Dandy becomes the new narrator, and he can just escape narrator prison and do his own thing. That is an absurd sentence, but the fact that Space Dandy actually turns its narrator into a real character with motivations and like conflicts and a story arc is such a wild thing to do. And it's these type of decisions that really make Space Dandy culminate into something that's more powerful than what I think Cowboy Bebop does, what I think Samurai Champloo does. And the thing is, those series kind of begin with self-serious expectations and the idea that you're building to something great. Space Dandy kind of spits in the face of those expectations, and it gives you drama and surprises that hit even harder because you're not expecting them. It kind of conditions you to think that this is a dumb show that won't have big payoffs, so when they do happen, you're kind of just blown away. It's a really powerful thing that the show can do.
It's times like these when a man's gotta do what a man's gotta do. And this man's got to do.
Space Dandy really makes a name for itself as an episodic show that feels almost tantamount to an anthology in the way that each episode does something totally different. There are a lot of shows like this. Cowboy Bebop subscribes to this in a lot of the same ways. Space Dandy stands out though, because not only is it just doing episodic anthology-ish storytelling, but every episode basically becomes a completely different genre. It's a really imaginative way for the show to constantly reinvent itself, to experiment with like meta, self-aware storytelling, and to really take some big risks that are honestly rare in a anime of this nature. It's akin to like early Futurama episodes where you get these stories that are so funny, but also just remarkably smart at the same time too, and really just playing with physics, science fiction, and just the rules that we think govern the universe. There's a lot of really fun experimental storytelling in Space Dandy that makes it feel like akin to almost like Flash Gordon or like Silver Age Superman stories, or even something like an Amazing Stories anthology that's really just doing whatever it wants and just going on vibes. And that's a really fun, like freeing idea at the end of the day. Like, there's a Space Dandy episode that focuses on a war between a two-dimensional universe and a three-dimensional universe where a four-dimensional relic is kind of what these universes are fighting for. So you get these ideas on like two-dimension, three-dimension, and fourth dimension, and how they just come together in a ridiculous like physics kind of explosion. At the same time, there's an episode that's just like a fun drag race episode. There's a musical episode that's very much like riffing on High School Musical. You get some Pygmalion fun in there. There's like a wrestling episode. One of like my favorites is this Fellini kind of riffing thing that does this big commentary on life and death. And maybe the most brilliant episode they do, which is quite early in the show's run, is this big zombie outbreak horror thing where not only do everyone in the show become zombies, but it reaches the point where the narrator becomes a zombie, and it reaches the climax where the narrator is narrating the show through unintelligible zombie grunts. And that is so funny. Space Dandy is just a show that will take every joke to its apex and really isn't afraid to just go further than any other show would go. I mean, they have a multiverse episode that's way ahead of the curve and still is like really relevant today and does smarter things than what you're seeing in current multiverse stories. And just, even though this show is over a decade old at this point, all of its episodes, like 95% of its episodes, are still stories that feel ahead of its time, which is kind of just a testament to how much work was put in this show. And, you know, they weren't just trying to tell an easy story. This is really boundary-pushing, genre-pushing storytelling, which you can see why it was so creatively stimulating for Watanabe, but also why that might not connect with a mainstream audience that kind of has just like a tunnel vision for this sort of thing.
Here's anger, and of course, sadness. You may not hear the subtle differences, but I assure you each moan is unique.
To bank off of kind of the genre play idea, something that I think Space Dandy does even better than Cowboy Bebop, and why it is kind of this be-all, end-all show, it's such a brilliant idea. Basically, Watanabe went out to different animators, animation directors, and designers and asked them to help create the planets, aliens, and spaceships in this show. With the idea being, these are different planets, these are different universes, they should feel alien in nature. And I mean, Space Dandy is a Bones show. Bones has a great creative team. They could have crushed this assignment, but if you really want to make different worlds feel different, they need to be done by completely different people. If you have one person who is working on everything, even if it goes in different extremes, there are still inherent biases, some conscious things that we can't process that still come out in our work. So Space Dandy does a decision that takes longer, it costs more money, it's not the easiest thing to do, but because of this, it has such a unique point of view because every episode, every planet looks and feels totally different in a way that is so atypical for a show because it's really just committed to this project and to just go for broke with imagination. What I love about this so much is through this experimentation, this is how I discovered about Masaaki Yuasa, who was the person recruited recruited to do the episode Slow and Steady Wins the Race, Baby, which is this really interesting story about like an alien fish that becomes a morbid love story. Basically, this episode is so gorgeous. The animation is just like eye-popping, and I fell in love with this episode. I was like, who made this? And I learned all about Yuasa. I watched all of his work, and that experience is not unique to me. It's not unique to this one episode. It's so beautiful that a show like Space Dandy can actively teach people about different creatives, about different animators, and just like passionately bolster outside fandom. You know, Space Dandy is a show that by the time you're done watching it, you might just not love Studio Bones, but there might be 5 other directors, designers that you fall in love with too. This show really spreads the wealth in a way that's rare, in a way that I don't know if you'll see happen again. Like, it was a big risk to do this kind of outsourcing approach, but it's so smart, and I just love the energy it gives to the show. It's a true shame that there isn't a 500-page art book for Space Dandy that really breaks all this down. There are art books for simpler shows, but Space Dandy really just commits to the bit. It commits to the bit in everything it does, but this is one creative decision that must have been fought against so hard and just pays off so much in the end. Anytime you're told no for doing something creative, just think of what Watanabe did with the different studios and different creatives working on Space Dandy, because it's just so special here, and another reason why this show was just like too good for its time.
It certainly appears that he was an unregistered alien. Of course, we can't register him now that he's basically a grilled fish.
I guess, you know, we might as well eat him.
We've talked about a lot of the different ways that Space Dandy is unique in a one-of-a-kind show, but one other area that I think is really cool and honestly part of anime dubbing history is the fact that it really broke barriers in the simul-dub department. Simul-dub is basically a term that's used when an anime's dub hits the same time as the Japanese subtitled version. That is a very hard thing to do. You see it happen very rarely, even now. This is 10 years after Space Dandy came out, and it's even difficult to have English subtitles come out on a service like Crunchyroll the exact same day as it's launching in Japan. We've gotten better in that sense, and it is easier to have simul-subs come out, but simul-dub is a real tricky territory that is still something that the dubbing community is negotiating through. But Space Dandy not only was a true simul-dub, the first simul-dub, mind you, what is so unique about it is the English dubbed version was actually coming out a day earlier than when it aired in Japan. That the Adult Swim premiere for Space Dandy was the true premiere. It was hitting Adult Swim before it did in Japan, which is even rarer to not just get a simul-dub, but a show where the dub is actually coming out before the Japanese version is really unheard of, and it really kind of shows you the mindset that Adult Swim and Toonami were in a decade ago, that they really wanted to be this carefully curated boutique anime service that wasn't just like a distributor or a broadcaster for anime. They really wanted to be involved in the process and just get involved in a way where they can have a say, help influence product, and do something special with it. And Space Dandy really was impressive in that sense. And the fact that this was a simul-dub, it doesn't feel rushed. It doesn't feel like anything has been compromised. The dub is just as good as the subtitled version, in my opinion, which is even more impressive knowing that they were on such a tight crunch time to put out these episodes and really didn't have the sort of feedback loop that you have a lot of the time with an anime when it's being subtitled, when it's being dubbed. Space Dandy was even just released internationally at the same time across the world because they wanted everyone to be watching it at once. They wanted just it to hit on a mainstream international level, which didn't really happen. Admittedly, this is a hard thing to pull off. It's difficult to ever make something hit in every single corner of the world. I think Space Dandy had the right approach. I think they did something really admirable, and if nothing else, I think it really helped evolve the dubbing community. Like I said, 10 years later after Space Dandy, simul-dubs are still extremely rare, but Space Dandy really helped show that this is possible, that it's not impossible, and that there can be a really tight window between a Japanese release and an English release, and the fact that Space Dandy broke barriers in that sense is just another reason why this show is special and that it was breaking the rules and really just a one-of-a-kind experience.
Space Dandy, Saturday at 11:30.
I didn't mean to do that. Oh, fuck!
Only Toonami on Adult Swim.
So we've talked about Space Dandy, why it's unique in the sense of what Watanabe brings to the equation, how it experiments with different genres, the way it brings different studios involved, its use of music, its simul-dub quality, and in the end, it's like, what is the legacy for this show? You have some shows that just disappear, you have shows that hit after the fact, and really quite recently, New York Comic Con 2024, Watanabe was there, and he had some very bittersweet things to say about Space Dandy. He openly said that Space Dandy is the show that he had the most fun on and the least stress. That this is a show where he felt creatively supported in a way that he's never felt before, and that he really just felt like a kid making this show. Now that being said, he does feel a lot of disappointment for this program in the fact that it didn't connect on a mainstream level, that he wasn't able to make more of it, and that it is kind of seen as a failure, that it didn't really connect in Japan or North America in the way that it was perceived. And it's interesting, right? And I mean, let's try to break down why Space Dandy didn't connect. And I think one of the reasons for this problem is it just started too silly. I mean, I think silliness is one of Space Dandy's fortes, but the first few episodes are kind of so expendable and frivolous that this might have given the audience just the wrong idea, that they might have thought it was just a dumb show that isn't important, which is honestly so ironic considering the gravitas that's created for the final few episodes of this show. But it's very easy to bleed viewers when it seems like, okay, this is a silly show, I can check in whenever, and it's really not going to make a difference. I'm not seeing much of a serialized storyline. If I watch it in 3 weeks, it's not going to make a difference if I watch it tomorrow. That's dangerous, you know? Like a show like Cowboy Bebop sets up its endgame right from the start, and that entices viewers to stick with the show, to kind of keep moving along and know what you're building to. Space Dandy doesn't do that at all, and the big surprises that come at the end aren't set up. Like, it's really quite coy, sly, and just kind of a lot of subterfuge of how it makes you lower your expectations and lower your just resistance until it then throws you up at the end, and it's really a one-of-a-kind thing. So despite how that silliness is like a superpower for the show, I do think if it maybe kind of teased where it was going from the start, there might have been more people involved in just sticking with the show. I do think the show's second season, its final 13 episodes, do bring a little more to the table than the first 13, so maybe if just episode order was played around with a little more, it might have had a little more success. But at the end of the day, it's really just a shame. Like, beyond these 26 episodes, all that really exists for Space Dandy is there's a manga adaptation, and there's a really, like, phoned-in mobile video game that's like a Galaga reskin. So weird that they'd be like, we will do a Space Dandy video game, but it's just gonna be Galaga. So there's a little more there, but, like, really not a lot to feed fans in the way that sometimes there's a 13-episode anime that then just keeps putting out light novels and manga, and the series can live on through that. Space Dandy did kind of just disappear after its, 2014, when it had the success. And it's really too bad. I mean, at the end of the day, I do think this is a show that Adult Swim should have gone all in on, in the way that they kind of embraced Fooly Cooley. It was a really big deal when Jason DeMarco was like, we're doing 3 new Fooly Cooley shows, and people were like, well, I guess that's cool, but do we really need more Fooly Cooley? This was a really mixed project at the end of the day. People didn't know, like, there's a lot of hate for the new Fooly Cooley, and at the end of the day, I think most people would agree the first season is the best. We maybe didn't need more. Space Dandy is a show that actively necessitates more, that there are more stories to tell in this universe, and it's really a shame that, like, for the show's 10th anniversary, we didn't get a new Adult Swim special, especially since, like, Adult Swim has a good relationship with Watanabe. He came in to do the Blade Runner stuff, he's doing Lazarus. I mean, what should have happened is Watanabe should have been, yes, I will do Lazarus for you. I know the kind of viewership that Lazarus is going to bring for you. This is on the contingency that I can do a Space Dandy movie. This is on the contingency I can do a 6-episode Space Dandy return. Watanabe really should have been playing that card a little more, because he continually talks about how, like, Space Dandy is this, missed opportunity for him, that he still doesn't understand why it didn't work. There's disappointment for what came out of it, but he still loves it so much. He keeps talking about it. He keeps expressing his love, and it really just is a shame that there's so little of it to consume, and that it's not even something that's like on rotation on Adult Swim anymore. Like, you really have to seek it if you want to find it. The physical media of the show was out of print for a long time too, so it really did feel like it just disappeared. And so whether this is all we have of Space Dandy, whether we do finally get a movie down the road, whether we get some Watanabe crossover project that puts all of this together, who knows? But you at least know now that Space Dandy is worth your time. You should watch it before Lazarus comes out, because who knows? He has all these connected universes. There could be Space Dandy references in Lazarus, and you don't want to be missing those out. You don't want to not know what's going on in Lazarus, guys. It's going to be the biggest anime of 2025, so you got to get on that boat.
I just realized something. Honestly, it kinda doesn't matter where I go. Whether I'm alive or dead, I'm still pretty dandy.
If I'm not mistaken, fellow otaku, we have just enough time for another installment of The Big Three. Okay, everybody, Big Three time. For those of you who don't know, Big Three, it's just a literal odds and ends segment. There's so much anime out there, it's impossible to stay on top of everything, even for me, guys. There's gonna be titles that slip through the cracks. So this is our way of kind of just shining a light on stuff, whether it's old or new. And honestly, guys, we're doing a bit of a sneaky one here. This is actually a covert combo Big Three Release the Hounds episode. So if you wanna do it with me, that's also Release the Hounds. Okay, so to keep with the Watanabe theme, the Big Three Release the Hounds picks I've focused on are all Watanabe series. So some of these we've talked about a little already, but I'm going to get a little deeper on them. And all of these shows are available on physical media too. They have some really great physical media sets, some really special features going on in there too. So if you like these shows, stream them, watch them, but all of them, you can get them on physical media too, and you can own them forever. So just put that on the table. This is a bit of a combo, Big Three, Release the Hound. So the first of these shows is Samurai Champloo. Samurai Champloo came out in 2004. Funnily enough, Watanabe kind of conceived of this anime and was working on it while he was working on the Animatrix and the Cowboy Bebop movie. Basically, he kind of fell in love with this idea of like the healing power of hip-hop's subculture. And that really kind of gets funneled into Samurai Champloo. It's a show about three people on the quest for a samurai. It's set in an anachronistic Edo period of Japan. Basically, it has this really kind of touching energy just about acceptance of minorities and kind of an acceptance of death as well. And I mean, an acceptance and confrontation of death is very much present in Watanabe's previous series, Macross Plus and Cowboy Bebop, but that theme really gets to evolve in Samurai Champloo. I mean, people love the show because of the action, because of the characters, and because of the music. But I really think it is just that fun road trip quality where you have just hip-hop in a situation where it shouldn't. Samurai Champloo has really resonated with people. Some people even prefer it to Cowboy Bebop. It's really taken away. We had a live-action Cowboy Bebop that failed in a huge way. Honestly, we don't need to do it, but you could do a live-action Samurai Champloo and it would maybe work. I don't know if we should, but I mean, Samurai Champloo has a lot of love in it. You could do a lot of fun stuff. Mattson Tomlin, the creator of Terminator Zero, he's a huge Samurai Champloo fan. He listens to the soundtrack all the time. There's a lot of Samurai Champloo's DNA funneled into Terminator Zero as well. So just if you want a fun action series, a fun samurai series, a fun hip-hop series, Samurai Champloo is the way to go.
I can't imagine a more perfect setting. Aren't you going to run? Nah, but go ahead. Don't stay on my account.
Next of these series is Terror in Resonance. This came out a decade after Samurai Champloo. It is a 2014 anime, and it's really interesting because Terror in Resonance and Space Dandy came out the same year, and it's kind of funny that they're at such different extremes. Space Dandy is such a silly, absurdist celebratory show, whereas Terror in Resonance, very sad, very bleak, very nihilistic. It's an 11-episode anime that's kind of this cat and mouse story where child soldiers steal an atomic bomb and threaten to blow up Tokyo unless a cryptic riddle of theirs can get solved. So you have this very stripped down, concise narrative about trying to catch these two kids, figure out what they're up to, and just how to prevent this apocalypse from going on. Like we were saying before, it has this Icelandic soundtrack that really kind of creates this isolating feeling. There's a real feeling of raging against a machine that nobody wanted in the first place. It is such an emotionally distant show that whenever you do see a genuine exchange of love and humanity, it stands out even more. It's really a show about like accepting that the world is ruined and that things have entered this place of ambivalence and finding out how to get through that and just feel human in a world that's becoming increasingly scary. So Terror in Resonance, I think, is a little more of a niche cut for Watanabe. Not everyone watches it because it is really sad. It's only 11 episodes, so you can breeze through this thing. It is kind of a darker change of pace for Watanabe, but something that I do feel continues the themes he's been playing with and a necessary vehicle for him to get out of his system. Like, if you couldn't get all that sadness into Terror in Resonance, you might have not had a show that's as bombastic as Space Dandy.
It's been so long. I haven't laughed like that in forever. I forgot how nice it felt.
The last of these shows is Carole and Tuesday. Carole and Tuesday is one of Watanabe's most recent series. It's so fun, so affable, really doesn't feel like a Watanabe series. It's about two struggling musicians from different backgrounds who find each other and start playing music together on Mars. It's set on Mars 50 years after humanity has turned Mars into like a livable society. And you're just kind of following these two buskers who fall in love with each other, with music, and really have an identity through performance. And I mean, there are so many anime about the power of community through creative expression, what music can do for people. You have shows like Girls Band Cry, Sound Euphonium, The Colors Within, Jellyfish Can't Swim in the Night. All of these shows are great and they get into different ideas, but I think Carole and Tuesday is so interesting because it's not just another girl music show, but it's Watanabe choosing to do one of those shows. I mean, I think a lot of people didn't even check this show out because they didn't know Watanabe was involved with it. It does have a lot of hard sci-fi concepts, but they can easily get kind of lost in all the poppy music element to it. The soundtrack's great. It's a show that really kind of leans into the idea that each character can have their own musical motif, that music is just as important as dialogue for characters a lot of the time. And it's just a really fun, breezy show. If you're kind of bogged down by something as intense as Terror in Resonance or even Cowboy Bebop, Carole and Tuesday is really a great palate cleanser and just a slice of like frivolity and just happiness at the end of the day. We can focus on like melodrama so often that we do at the end of the day kind of need stuff like Carole and Tuesday that just focuses on music, creative expressionism, friends, and how that can be beautiful at the end of the day. So once again, for the big three and Release the Hounds, we have Samurai Champloo, we have Terror in Resonance, and we have Carole and Tuesday. Unfortunately, fellow otaku, that's all the time we have in this episode before I get isekai'd back to reality. We would once again like to thank you for going on this adventure with us, because without you, we got nothing, baby. And remember, stay dandy, baby. Stay dandy.